As you know, Election Day now just 6 days away, and you'd think the goal would be we want as many people as possible to vote. But in many states, it appears just the opposite seems to be the aim. Many actually making it more difficult to vote. Here's just a few examples. There's way too many to list here. We'd need more than an hour. A town in Kansas, for example, moving its polling place several miles out of town. Local ACLU sued to get that city to move it back into town, saying it would suppress the vote, particularly for minorities. In Texas and Arizona, they have closed hundreds of polling places between them. Advocates for Latinos say that's because it was a concerted effort to make it harder for them to get to the polls. Several states, almost all of them red, they have strict vote ID laws. Low-income people and people of color, they complain that they are the ones who don't have photo IDs, so they say this targeting them. And joining me now with the legal ramifications of this, election law attorney Jerry Goldfeder. And Jerry, let me start by saying, is this, just normal when you get to, the Tuesday in November when we cast votes, or have you seen in recent years a much more concerted effort to make it harder and harder for certain populations to vote?
Well, there's been a real spike in a real increase in these kind of voter suppression activities. We actually have a long history, unfortunately, in the United States of suppressing the vote, of making it difficult. In the 1800s, we saw many Jim Crow laws. And what we've been seeing in the last decade or so is a tremendous increase in what we call second-generation vote suppression tactics, cutting back on early voting, making it a requirement to have photo IDs, decreasing the number of polling places, requiring your registration information to exactly match the information on other statewide documents. So it's difficult for many people to vote. Just in the last week, we have heard about the state of Georgia and the state of North Dakota. In Georgia, the Secretary of State who regulates the elections there, who happens to be the Republican candidate for governor, he has determined that 53,000, and that's a huge amount of voters, huge number, 53,000 voters' names on their registrations do not exactly match the names that they have on other state documents, and therefore they may not be able to vote. And in North Dakota, we have a situation where Native Americans who don't necessarily have addresses are not being permitted to vote without those addresses that are now required. If the elections are close, I'm sure we'll be involved in litigation in many states, in many congressional districts throughout this country. I hope that's not the case.
Let me get to a few of that. The argument from a lot of the conservatives is, hey, the reason why we're cracking down that every I needs to be dotted or T crossed and the signatures masses, we have a huge concern about voter fraud. People famously remember the president after 2016 and trying to explain how he lost the popular vote by as many million votes as he did, that it was all because of voter fraud. We can definitively now say, can't we, that that's just a crock of you-know-what, that there is zero evidence after God knows how many closer inspections that there is any massive voter fraud going on in this country?
We've had study after study demonstrating that there are so few cases of voter fraud that all these laws, these so-called prophylactic laws, are just a bogus excuse to suppress the vote.
To that end, the president's already telegraphed, to a point you made before, that, especially if these elections are close, he may not certify them, or he won't want state agencies to certify the vote if it's close and it does not go their way. To that end,
it's not up to the president.
I understand that, but give me an idea on what you possibly expect come Wednesday morning, with a lot of races in a lot of different states here, where if people don't like the results, they're going to cry foul. What then happens? And over what detailed issues do you expect will be the crux here of so many of these arguments?
Well, first of all, the president has no authority to say anything about any of the elections within the states, even the congressional elections. On the other hand, the states do have the authority and obligation to count the votes and count them accurately. And if the elections are close, they will make certain that all the absentee ballots and the provisional ballots are counted. We may not get results in certain congressional races, in certain state races, for several weeks after Election Day if the margins are close, because all the paper ballots need to be counted, and they will do so. And I believe that we can have a high level of confidence that the states will count the ballots and will do so as accurately as possible. And we can also have confidence that if there's any funny business going on in any of the states, there will be litigation. And unfortunately, we may have courts determine who has won, who the victors are in these close elections.
Finally, Jerry, I know a lot of people, for obvious reasons, not looking at their own particular congressional district, how that's going to turn out, or even the Senate race, but more than just which party's going to control both the House and the Senate. I imagine you're looking really closely at these statewide races for governor, and there's many that are up in November, especially with the census, and also in 2020, some of the redistricting that's going on. We could have a totally different political map depending on how Tuesday turns out, really, at the turn of the next decade.
Absolutely. The control of the state legislatures and the control of the governor's mansions in the various states will determine how the redistricting lines are drawn for the state legislatures and for Congress after the 2020 census. So it's really critical who wins the House and who wins the Senate, but it's also really critical which parties control the state legislatures and who wins the governor's mansions in the various states, because that will determine the lines for the next decade.
Well, it's going to be fascinating, and Jerry, I certainly appreciate your time. I have a feeling you're going to be busy next week. Jerry Goldfeder, thank you for the time.
You're quite welcome.
We'll be right back.